In the year 1247 BCE, a 12-year-old girl named Mariette was dragged from her mother's arms and handed to men in white linen robes. She screamed. Her mother collapsed. The priests smiled. What happened next in the inner sanctum of Karnak Temple was never written in hieroglyphs. It was never meant to be remembered. But the walls still whisper. And tonight, you're going to hear what they've been hiding for over 3,000 years. We are taught to look at ancient Egypt with wonder. The pyramids, the pharaohs, the gods carved in gold and stone. But there is another Egypt, one that exists in the gaps between inscriptions, one that thrived in the shadows of those towering columns. It is the Egypt of the forgotten, the Egypt of the girls who were called sacred but treated as currency, the Egypt where religion was not liberation but a cage with a divine lock. This is not the story they want you to know, but it is the story that must be told. Every video here is more than just content. It's crafted with love, talent, and the drive to create something meaningful. Subscribe this channel only if you're ready to see what they swore you'd never know. They erased this from history. We're putting it back. Subscribe before it disappears again, and press the bell icon also to get latest video at your door. The temples of ancient Egypt were not just places of worship. They were economic empires, political machines, centers of unimaginable wealth and unchecked power. And at the heart of this system was a practice so disturbing, so carefully hidden, that even ancient historians dared not speak its full truth. They called them gods' wives. They called them divine adoratresses. They called them chantresses of Amun. Beautiful titles, holy titles. But beneath those words was a reality soaked in exploitation, psychological torment, and ritualized abuse that would make your blood run cold. These were not women who chose devotion. These were girls who were sold, traded, and sacrificed to satisfy debts, political alliances, and the insatiable hunger of the priestly class. And what the priests did to them in the name of the gods is a secret that has been buried for millennia until now. Let's start with how they were taken. In the villages along the Nile, families lived under the constant threat of debt, crop failures, floods, taxes imposed by the state and temple authorities. When a family could not pay, the priests came. They did not come with swords. They came with scrolls, legal documents, religious justifications. They told the parents that their daughter had been chosen by the gods, that she would be honored, that her service would cleanse the family's debt and ensure their place in the afterlife. The language was divine. The intent was transactional. The girl was collateral. And once the agreement was made, there was no escape. War also fed this system. When Egypt conquered neighboring lands, the spoils were not just gold and grain. They were people. Young girls from Nubia, Libya, and the Levant were brought back as tribute. They were paraded through the streets as symbols of Egypt's dominance. And then they disappeared into the temples. These girls did not speak Egyptian. They did not know the gods. They did not understand the rituals. But they learned quickly, because refusal meant death. Obedience meant survival. And somewhere between those two realities, their childhood was erased. They were renamed, redressed, reprogrammed. They became property of the divine, which meant they became property of the priests. Once inside the temple walls, the girl's old life was systematically destroyed. Her name was replaced with a title. Her clothing was replaced with linen robes that marked her as temple property. Her hair was shaved or styled in the exact manner dictated by the priests. She was taught to walk differently, to speak differently, to think differently. This was not education. This was erasure. The goal was to strip away every piece of her identity so that what remained was a blank vessel, a living tool, a body in service to a system that saw her not as human, but as sacred object. The priests called this process purification. They said it was necessary to remove the taint of the outside world, to make her worthy of serving the gods. But purification is not what happened in those dark chambers. What happened was indoctrination, isolation, sensory deprivation. The girl was kept in dim rooms, fed minimally, spoken to only in religious language. She was told that her family had abandoned her, that the outside world no longer existed, that her only reality was the temple. And slowly, day by day, her mind began to break. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, like a rope fraying one thread at a time, until, one day, she stopped resisting. And that was the day she became useful. The title God's Wife sounds poetic, even romantic, but the reality was grotesque. These girls were not wives in any human sense. They were symbolic brides to the god Amun, the king of the gods. And the god, of course, could not consummate the marriage, but his representatives on earth could and did. The high priests and senior temple officials held absolute authority over these girls. They controlled when they ate, when they slept, when they performed rituals, and when they were summoned to private chambers for ceremonies that were never recorded, never spoken of, never questioned. These private rituals were cloaked in religious language. The priests claimed they were channeling the god's will, that the girl's body was a vessel for divine energy, that what happened in those rooms was holy. But there were no witnesses, no records, no oversight. Just a man with unchecked power and a child who had been taught that disobedience was blasphemy. The psychological manipulation was surgical. The girl was told that her suffering was sacred, that her pain was proof of the god's presence, that to resist was to reject the divine. And so she submitted, not because she believed, but because belief was the only way to survive.
The daily life of a temple virgin was one of relentless ritual and suffocating control. She woke before dawn to the sound of bells. She bathed in cold water mixed with natron, a salt that burned the skin. She dressed in robes that had been blessed and inspected. She walked barefoot on stone floors that froze in winter and scorched in summer. She chanted hymns she had memorized but did not understand. She carried offerings to statues that did not eat. She performed dances that left her body bruised and exhausted. And through it all, she was watched, every movement monitored, every word recorded, every moment controlled. There was no privacy, no rest, no moment where she was simply herself. The temple operated on a schedule designed to exhaust the body and numb the mind. The girl was kept in a state of constant activity so that she had no time to think, no time to question, no time to remember who she had been before. And when she finally collapsed into sleep, she did so on a thin mat in a shared chamber where even her dreams were not her own, because other girls were there. Girls who had learned not to speak of what happened. Girls who had learned that survival meant silence. And so the silence became a second skin, an armor made of compliance and suppressed screams. But the worst part was not the labor. It was not the exhaustion. It was the rituals that happened in the inner sanctum, the place where only the highest priests and the chosen girls were allowed. the place where the walls were covered in scenes of gods and goddesses in eternal embrace, the place where the air smelled of incense and something else, something rotting beneath the perfume. This was where the god was said to dwell. This was where the girl was brought when the moon was dark and the temple was silent. She was told to lie on a stone altar. She was told to close her eyes. She was told that the god would visit her, that she would feel his presence, that she must remain still no matter what happened. And then the priests entered, masked, robed, anonymous. They chanted in voices that echoed off the walls. They touched her in ways that had nothing to do with divinity and everything to do with dominance. And when it was over, they told her she had been blessed, that she had been chosen, that she should feel honored. And because she had no other framework to understand what had happened, she believed them. Or at least, she pretended to, because pretending was the only way to keep her mind from shattering completely.
The psychological control extended beyond the physical. The priests understood something that modern psychologists would not articulate for thousands of years, that trauma, when paired with ritual, creates a bond stronger than chains. The girl was made to believe that her suffering had meaning, that it was part of a cosmic plan, that the gods required her pain, and so she gave it willingly. Not because she was weak, but because the alternative was to believe that her suffering was meaningless, that she had been betrayed by her family, her society, and her gods, and that truth was too terrible to bear. So she clung to the narrative the priests gave her. She performed the rituals with increasing devotion. She learned to dissociate during the worst moments, to send her mind somewhere else while her body remained. She became what they wanted, a perfect victim who believed she was a chosen servant. And the tragedy is that this was not unique to her. This was the experience of thousands of girls across centuries. Each one told the same lies, each one believing she was alone, each one dying a little more inside every day until there was nothing left but the role she had been forced to play. Some girls tried to resist. They refused to chant. They spat at the priests. They tried to run, but resistance was met with swift and brutal punishment. Not always physical. The priests were too clever for that. Physical scars could be seen. Questions could be asked. Instead, they used methods that left no marks. Sleep deprivation, food deprivation, solitary confinement in underground chambers where the only sound was the girl's own breathing. They told her that the gods were angry, that her family would suffer for her disobedience, that she was cursed. And after days or weeks of this, the girl broke. She apologized. She begged for forgiveness. She promised to obey. And when she was brought back into the light, the other girls saw what happened to those who resisted. And they learned. They learned that hope was more dangerous than despair. There are records, fragmentary and obscure, of girls who tried to escape, who climbed walls in the dead of night, who bribed guards, who faked illness. But the temple had eyes everywhere. Informants among the servants, spies among the lower priests. And the world outside offered no sanctuary. A runaway temple virgin was considered cursed. No family would take her in. No village would shelter her. She was marked, tainted. And if she was caught, the punishment was designed to be a warning to others. She was paraded before the other girls. She was beaten. She was branded. And then she was locked away in the darkest corner of the temple, where her screams could be heard, but her face could not be seen. A ghost. A cautionary tale. A reminder that there was no escape. The food they were given was minimal. Bread, onions, weak beer.
just enough to keep them alive but never enough to give them strength. Malnutrition kept their bodies weak and their minds foggy. It made them compliant, easier to control. The priests ate lavishly. They drank wine. They feasted on meat and honey and fruit. But the girls who served the gods ate like prisoners. And perhaps that is what they were. Prisoners in a system that used religion as a cage and devotion as chains. Some girls developed illnesses, fevers, infections, strange bleeding that would not stop. The priests called these signs of divine presence. They said the god was working through her body. They said her suffering was purification. But there were no healers called, no medicine given. The girl was left to endure, and if she died, she was buried quickly and quietly. Her name was added to a list of the honored dead, a list no one outside the temple ever saw. Her family was told she had ascended to the realm of the gods, that she was blessed, that they should be proud, and they believed it. Because what else could they believe? But not all the girls were silent. Some whispered to each other in the dark. They shared their pain in the only moments they were not watched. They formed bonds that were part sisterhood, part survival pact. They held each other when the nightmares came. They invented small rebellions, a deliberately mistimed chant, a glance that conveyed contempt, a hymn sung just slightly off-key. These were tiny acts of defiance, but they were acts of humanity, proof that somewhere beneath the programming, the girl still existed. There are carvings hidden in obscure corners of temple walls that archaeologists have found but cannot explain. Symbols that are not part of the official religious canon. Names scratched in places no one was supposed to see. Messages written in a code that has never been fully deciphered. Some scholars believe these were left by the temple virgins, desperate attempts to leave proof that they existed, that they were real, that their suffering mattered. And when you stand in those temples today, as a tourist marveling at the grandeur, you might walk past one of those carvings without even noticing. But it is there. A scream carved in stone, a message from the past that says, I was here. I suffered. Remember me. The priests justified the system with theology. They taught that the gods required purity, that the girls were vessels of divine energy, that their suffering was a necessary sacrifice to maintain cosmic order. They wrote treatises on the spiritual significance of virginity. They created elaborate mythologies around the concept of the god's wife. They turned exploitation into doctrine. And because they controlled the written word, their version of reality became the only version. The girls had no voice, no platform, no way to tell their side of the story. And so history recorded what the priests wanted it to record: the glory, the grandeur, the divine service, but not the screams behind the temple walls. This is how systems of oppression sustain themselves, by controlling the narrative, by making the suffering invisible, by convincing both the oppressor and the oppressed that the system is natural, divinely ordained, unchangeable. The priests believed they were doing holy work. They believed the girls were honored. They had convinced themselves so thoroughly that they could sleep peacefully after a night in the inner sanctum. And that, perhaps, is the most disturbing part of all. Not that they were monsters, but that they were men who believed they were righteous, who used religion to justify the unjustifiable, who built a system of abuse and called it worship. The psychological damage was lifelong. The girls who survived to adulthood were hollow. Their eyes had a particular emptiness that other Egyptians recognized and avoided.
They moved through the world like shadows. They had learned to be invisible, to take up no space, to need nothing, to feel nothing. Some of them eventually left the temple, released when they were too old to be useful. They were given a small pension and sent into a world they no longer understood. They had no family, no skills outside of ritual, no identity beyond the role they had been forced to play. Most of them died alone, forgotten, their names lost to history. But some of them spoke, quietly, in whispers to other women. They passed down stories that were never written, oral histories that survived in the margins of society, stories of what really happened in the temples, stories that mothers told daughters as warnings, stories that were dismissed as exaggerations or myths. But they were not myths. They were testimonies. And though they were never recorded by the official scribes, they circulated, they survived, and they planted seeds of doubt. Seeds that would, centuries later, grow into questions, into investigations, into the realization that the official history was a lie. Modern archaeology has uncovered evidence that supports these dark stories. Skeletal remains of young girls found in temple complexes showing signs of malnutrition and repeated trauma. Medical analyses revealing injuries consistent with abuse. Inscriptions that, when translated correctly, hint at practices that were hidden from public view. But even today, there is resistance to acknowledging this history. Museums prefer to focus on the grandeur. Documentaries celebrate the mystery and beauty. Tour guides gloss over the uncomfortable realities. Because acknowledging that ancient Egypt was not just a civilization of wonders, but also a civilization of horrors, requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, religion, and exploitation. It requires us to admit that the same institutions we romanticize were built on the suffering of the powerless, that the temples we admire were also prisons, that the priests we revere as wise men were also abusers, and that the girls who were called holy were actually victims of a system that saw them as disposable. This is not the story that sells tickets. This is not the narrative that inspires awe, but it is the truth. And the truth, no matter how disturbing, deserves to be told. The system persisted for over 1,000 years. Dynasties rose and fell. Pharaohs came and went, but the temples remained, and so did the practice. Generation after generation of girls were fed into the machine, each one believing she was unique, each one suffering in isolation, each one dying a little more inside until there was nothing left but compliance. And the priests grew richer. The temples grew more powerful. The system refined itself. It became more efficient, more insidious, more difficult to challenge. There were occasional reforms, pharaohs who tried to limit the power of the priesthood, queens who spoke out against the treatment of temple women, but these reforms were always temporary. The priestly class was too entrenched, too wealthy, too politically connected. They outlasted the reformers, they waited out the protests, and when the noise died down, they went back to business as usual. Because they knew something that all oppressive systems know, that if you control the narrative, you control reality. And they controlled the narrative completely. They were the ones who wrote the history. They were the ones who carved the inscriptions. They were the ones who decided what was remembered and what was forgotten. And they chose to forget the girls.
But history has a way of surfacing. Secrets have a way of leaking out. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as Egyptology became a formal discipline, archaeologists began finding things that did not fit the official narrative. Tombs that should not exist, inscriptions that hinted at forbidden practices, objects that suggested rituals far darker than what was publicly acknowledged. At first, these findings were dismissed or explained away, but as more evidence accumulated, the picture became impossible to ignore. Scholars began to piece together the hidden history. They cross-referenced archaeological finds with fragmentary texts from ancient critics of the priesthood. They analyzed the remains of temple complexes with new technologies that revealed hidden chambers and secret passages. They studied the skeletal remains with forensic techniques that told stories of trauma and suffering. And slowly, painstakingly, the truth began to emerge. Not the full truth. We will never have that. Too much has been destroyed, too much has been hidden. Too many voices were silenced before they could speak. But enough to know that what happened in those temples was not divine service. It was exploitation. It was abuse. It was a crime disguised as religion. The parallels to modern systems of exploitation are impossible to ignore. The language has changed. We no longer speak of gods in temples, but we still have systems that take vulnerable people and grind them up in the name of something greater. We still have institutions that hide abuse behind walls of respectability. We still have narratives controlled by those in power. We still have victims who are told their suffering has meaning, that it is necessary, that they should be honored. And we still have a society that prefers comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The story of Egypt's temple virgins is not just ancient history. It is a mirror. It shows us how easily exploitation can be normalized, how quickly abuse can be sacralized, how thoroughly victims can be silenced, and how important it is to question the official narrative, to dig beneath the surface, to listen to the whispers that history tried to erase. Because if we do not learn from the past, we are condemned to repeat it. And somewhere, right now, in some institution cloaked in respectability, the same dynamics are playing out. Different words, different justifications, but the same fundamental reality. Power exploiting the powerless while claiming divine or moral authority. There is a particular inscription found in a small temple in Upper Egypt. It was carved by an unknown hand in a location that suggests it was meant to be hidden. The hieroglyphs are crude, not the work of a professional scribe. The translation is uncertain, but the most widely accepted reading is this: "We were children. They called us holy. We call ourselves ghosts." 15 words. A lifetime of suffering compressed into 15 words. An accusation that echoes across millennia. A testimony that refuses to be silenced. When I first read that translation, I felt something shift. Because those words are not ancient. They're immediate. They're a voice breaking through the noise. They're proof that despite everything the priests did to erase these girls, to turn them into anonymous vessels, to strip away their humanity, something survived. A spark of defiance, a refusal to be forgotten, a message carved into stone with hands that probably trembled. Hands that belonged to someone who knew she would never be heard in her own time, but hoped that someday, somehow, someone would listen. And here we are, thousands of years later, listening, bearing witness, refusing to let the comfortable lie stand unchallenged. The question we must ask ourselves is this: what are we willing to see? It is easy to visit a museum and marvel at golden sarcophagi. It is comfortable to watch documentaries that celebrate ancient wisdom and architectural genius. It is pleasant to believe that the past was full of mysteries and magic. But are we willing to see the suffering that made those wonders possible? Are we willing to acknowledge that the gold was mined by slaves, that the temples were built by forced labor, that the priesthood maintained its power through exploitation? Are we willing to sit with the discomfort of knowing that civilizations we admire were also systems of profound injustice? This is not about canceling ancient Egypt. This is not about dismissing its achievements. This is about seeing the full picture, about understanding that human societies are complex, that they can create beauty and horror simultaneously, that the same hands that carved exquisite hieroglyphs also inflicted unspeakable cruelty, and that if we only focus on the beauty, we become complicit in erasing the victims. We become part of the system that prioritizes narrative over truth, comfort over justice, awe over accountability. So what happened to Mariette, the girl we met at the beginning of this journey? The 12-year-old dragged from her mother's arms in 1247 BCE. History does not record her fate. There is no tomb with her name, no inscription celebrating her service. She disappeared into the temple system like thousands before her and thousands after her. She became a number, a body, a vessel. And then, eventually, she became nothing, not even a memory. But in telling her story, even without knowing the details, we give her something the priests tried to take away. We give her visibility. We acknowledge that she existed, that she mattered, that what happened to her was wrong. We refuse to let the official narrative be the only narrative. We carve our own inscription on the walls of history, one that says, "We see you. We remember you. Your suffering was not sacred. Your pain was not divine. You were a child who deserved protection, and instead, you were betrayed." And though we cannot undo what was done, we can bear witness. We can tell the truth. We can make sure that your ghost does not wander in silence. This is the secret that history tried to bury. This is the truth that the priests did not want you to know. Behind the golden facade of ancient Egypt's temples was a system that consumed the lives of countless girls, that turned religious devotion into a weapon, that used the language of the sacred to justify the profane. And the most disturbing part is how successful they were. For thousands of years, the secret held. The official narrative stood unchallenged. The girls remained nameless, voiceless, erased. But secrets have a weight, and eventually that weight becomes too heavy to carry. The evidence seeps out, the whispers grow louder, the inscriptions are found, the bones tell their stories, and we are left with a choice. Do we turn away? Do we retreat back into the comfortable myth? Or do we stand in the discomfort and say, "This happened, this was real, this matters"? Because if we choose the latter, we do more than just honor the victims of the past. We sharpen our ability to see the systems of exploitation that exist in the present. We become harder to fool, harder to manipulate, harder to silence. And that is what those in power fear most. Not that we will learn history, but that we will learn from it.